The Arizona Territory summer of 1888 was merciless. The sun hammered down like a blacksmith's anvil, turning the desert floor into a shimmering furnace that could kill a man in hours. Jacob "Jake" Thompson wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he guided his horse along the narrow trail leading away from his ranch. At 34, Jake had learned to read the desert like scripture. Every cactus shadow, every shift in the wind, every distant dust devil told a story of survival or death. His blue-gray eyes, creased from years of squinting against the harsh light, scanned the horizon with practiced caution. The drought had been going on for 3 months now. Wells across the territory were running dry, cattle were dying, and desperate people were doing desperate things. But Jake had been blessed. His wells still ran clear and cold, fed by an underground spring his late father had discovered 20 years ago. His father. Jake's jaw tightened as he remembered the old man's words. "Son, when God blesses you with plenty, it's not so you can hoard it. It's so you can share it." That's what brought Jake to this abandoned well every morning, just as the sun crested the jagged mountains to the east. The stone structure sat at the intersection of 3 trails, one leading to Tucson, another to the Mexican border, and the third winding north toward Apache territory. It had been dry for 5 years, but it still provided the only shade for miles in any direction. Jake dismounted, his worn leather boots crunching on the sun-baked earth. From his saddlebags, he withdrew 2 large clay jugs filled with fresh water and a cloth bundle containing jerky, hardtack, and dried fruit. He'd been leaving supplies here every day for 4 months, ever since the drought began. He never knew who, if anyone, took them. Sometimes the supplies were gone by evening, sometimes they sat untouched for days. But Jake continued the routine with the faithfulness of a priest saying morning prayers. As he arranged the supplies in the precious shade of the stone well, Jake wondered about the mysterious travelers who might find them. Were they prospectors heading into the mountains? Mexican families fleeing revolution? Desperate souls who'd lost everything to the drought? He'd never seen a single person on this trail, but the supplies disappeared often enough to convince him someone needed them. That was enough. "Lord," Jake murmured, removing his battered hat and running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair, "whoever finds this, let it be what they need." The prayer was simple, honest, like everything else about Jake Thompson. He'd never been a man of many words, but his actions spoke volumes. 3 years ago, cholera had taken his wife Martha and their infant son Samuel. The grief had nearly destroyed him, but it had also taught him something profound about the value of each human life. Jake remounted his horse and headed back toward his ranch, unaware that eyes were watching him from a cluster of Palo Verde trees 50 yards away. Elena Vasquez crouched motionless in the meager shade, her heart pounding as she observed the tall, lean man who had just saved her life for the 10th time. Elena was 28, though the hardships of the past year had aged her beyond her years. Her long black hair was braided practically down her back, and her clothes, a simple brown cotton dress and worn leather boots, bore the dust and stains of constant travel. Her mixed Apache-Mexican heritage showed in her high cheekbones and bronze skin, but it was her eyes that truly defined her. Dark, intelligent, and constantly alert for danger. She waited until Jake's figure disappeared over a distant ridge before emerging from her hiding place. Behind her, 4 children materialized from the desert like shadows, orphans she'd rescued from the brutal Carlisle Industrial School 6 months ago. There was Mary Littlefeather, 14, whose Apache name was Small Eagle. Despite her youth, she possessed the quiet wisdom of someone who'd seen too much suffering. Her younger brother, Tommy, only 8, clung to her hand with the desperate trust of a child who'd learned that adults could disappear without warning. Miguel Santos, 10 years old, had been torn from his Mexican family after they were killed in a border raid. His infectious smile had dimmed but never died, and he still made jokes to keep the younger children's spirits up. The youngest was Lucy, barely 6, whose tribal name had been Star That Dances at Dawn before the school stripped it away, along with her native language. She spoke only in whispers now, when she spoke at all. "Is it safe, Elena?" Mary asked in careful English, though she longed to speak in her native Apache. Elena studied the empty trail in both directions. "Yes, little eagle, but we must be quick." They approached the well like deer coming to water, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Elena had been surviving in the desert for 6 months, keeping 4 children alive while staying ahead of the military patrols hunting them. She'd learned to read danger in the wind, to find water in places that looked barren, to make a meal from plants others would overlook. But this stranger's daily offering had made the difference between survival and death more times than she could count. Eleanor uncorked one of the clay jugs and sniffed carefully, a habit born of necessity. But the water was always pure, cold, and fresh. She handed it to Lucy first, watching the child's hollow cheeks fill with relief as she drank. The jerky was good quality, unsalted and properly dried. The hardtack was tough, but nourishing, and the dried fruit was a luxury none of them had tasted since their escape. Whoever this man was, he knew what travelers needed. "Why doesn't he ever stay?" Miguel asked, speaking Spanish softly. Elena had taught all the children to switch languages quickly. It might save their lives someday. "Maybe he's an angel," Tommy whispered in Apache. Elena smiled, despite their circumstances. "Maybe he is, little one. But angels come in all forms." As they shared the precious supplies, Elena studied the man's tracks in the dust. Large boots, worn on the outside edges. A man who spent long hours in the saddle. The horse was well-shod and well-fed, suggesting the rider had resources. But more telling were the subtle signs of care in how he'd arranged the supplies, protected from sun and wind, easy for even a child to find. This wasn't charity given to ease a guilty conscience. This was genuine compassion from someone who understood need. After the children had eaten and drunk their fill, Eleanor carefully rationed the remaining supplies. They would need to make everything last until tomorrow, when the mysterious benefactor would hopefully return. "We should go," Mary said, glancing nervously at the sun. "The soldiers could come." Eleanor nodded. They'd learned to travel in the early morning and late evening, hiding during the hottest part of the day, when the desert was most likely to conceal their presence. But finding safe hiding places was becoming harder as the drought drove both animals and humans to compete for every patch of shade. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor noticed something she'd missed before: scratches in the stone wall of the well. Not random marks, but deliberate symbols. Apache signs for safe water and friend, carved so subtly that only someone familiar with the old ways would recognize them. Her heart stopped. This man knew. Somehow, some way, he knew who was taking his offerings. But if he knew they were Apache, why hadn't he reported them? The bounty for returned runaway students was $50 per child, more money than most men saw in 6 months. And if he knew they were led by a woman, the assumption would be kidnapping carrying a death sentence. Eleanor stared at the symbols, her mind racing. Could this be a trap? A way to lure them into the open? But if so, why continue the elaborate charade for months? Why waste precious supplies during a drought? "Elena!" Mary's voice was worried. "What is it?" Elena traced the symbols with her finger, feeling the careful work that had gone into them. No, this wasn't a trap. This was something far more dangerous. Hope. "Nothing, little eagle. We need to go." But as they melted back into the desert, Elena's thoughts remained with the mysterious rancher who left more than water and food. He left questions that kept her awake at night and hope that terrified her more than any soldier. That evening, as Jake sat on his ranch house porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, he thought about the symbols he'd carved at the well. He'd learned basic Apache during his years in the territory, enough to recognize the signs of people in desperate need. He didn't know exactly who was taking his offerings, but he had suspicions. The careful way supplies disappeared, never wastefully, always completely, suggested people who understood scarcity. The fact that his small gifts kept vanishing suggested regular travelers who'd come to depend on them. And lately, he'd begun finding things at the well that hadn't been there when he left. A cluster of wildflowers arranged near the water jugs, small stones stacked in a pattern that reminded him of Apache trail markers. Someone was saying, "Thank you," in the only way they dared. Jake had made his choice months ago. Whatever laws said about runaway Indians or escaped students, his conscience spoke louder. His water, his food, his choice. And he chose mercy. But tonight, something felt different. The air held a tension that made his horse restless and set the desert wildlife on edge. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, the first Jake had seen in 3 months. Rain would be a blessing, but it would also bring soldiers. Military patrols avoided the desert during clear weather, but a storm would drive them to seek shelter, and if they found tracks leading to the well, Jake made a decision. Tomorrow, he would leave more than water and food. He would leave a warning, and perhaps, if he was very careful, he might finally see the face of the person whose gratitude had been touching his heart for months. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Elena huddled with the children in a shallow cave 20 miles from the well. The storm would provide cover, but it would also make travel treacherous. Flash floods could appear without warning, and the normally dry arroyos would become death traps. But worse than the natural dangers were the human ones. Elena had spotted dust clouds on the southern horizon just before the storm hit, too organized to be anything but a military patrol. They were being hunted again, and this time the net was tightening. Tomorrow, she would have to make a choice that could save them all or get them killed. Tomorrow, she would have to trust a stranger whose kindness might be the only thing standing between 4 innocent children and a return to the living hell they'd escaped. As lightning split the sky and thunder rolled across the desert, Elena whispered prayers in 3 languages, Apache, Spanish, and English, calling on every god she knew to protect the mysterious rancher who'd been protecting them. Because tomorrow she was going to need all the courage she'd ever possessed to step out of the shadows and face the man who'd been saving their lives 1 clay jug at a time. Dawn broke grey and threatening over the Arizona desert. The storm had passed, leaving the air thick with humidity and the ground treacherous with hidden pools of standing water. Jake Thompson checked his supplies twice before heading out. Something about the morning felt different, charged with possibility and danger. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Chester, picked his way carefully along the rain-slicked trail. The desert had transformed overnight from brown and barren to a canvas of subtle greens as dormant plants awakened to the precious moisture. But Jake's attention wasn't on the miraculous resurrection of plant life. It was on the fresh tracks he'd been following for the past mile. Bootprints, small and light, and beside them, the bare footprints of children. Jake's pulse quickened. For months, he'd been leaving supplies for phantoms. Now, it seemed the phantoms were real and close enough that the rain hadn't washed away their passage. He rounded a bend in the trail and stopped dead. There, at the abandoned well, stood a woman. She was turned away from him, but Jake could see she was young, with long black hair braided down her back. Her brown dress was practical but worn, and she moved with the careful economy of someone who'd learned that wasted motion could mean death. As Jake watched, the woman arranged something beside his usual water jugs, a small bouquet of desert wildflowers and what looked like a piece of Apache beadwork. She was leaving gifts in return for his offerings. Jake cleared his throat softly, not wanting to startle her. "Morning, ma'am." The woman spun around with lightning reflexes, her hand moving to a knife at her belt. For a heartbeat, they stared at each other across 20 yards of desert floor. Elena Vasquez felt her world tilt on its axis. The mysterious benefactor was younger than she'd expected, with kind eyes and the weathered face of a man who worked with his hands. But most importantly, he'd approached slowly, openly, making himself vulnerable rather than trying to intimidate. "You're him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The one who's been leaving water." Jake nodded slowly, his hands visible and empty. "Yes, ma'am. And you're the one who's been taking it." The silence stretched between them, heavy with months of unspoken gratitude and carefully maintained distance. Elena's dark eyes searched Jake's face, looking for deception, for the cruel satisfaction of a trap sprung. She found only honest concern and something that looked like relief. Elena started, then stopped. "What did you say to someone who'd been saving your life every day for months? Someone who'd asked nothing in return, demanded no explanations, required no payment?" "You don't need to explain," Jake said gently. "I've been hoping you were safe, whoever you were." "Safe?" Elena laughed, but there was no humor in it. "We haven't been safe since we left the school." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and Elena tensed. She'd just admitted to being a runaway from one of the government schools. In most men's eyes, that made her a criminal. But Jake just nodded. "The Carlisle school? You know about it?" "I know enough." Jake's voice carried a weight of sadness. "I know children go in speaking their native tongues and come out speaking only English. I know families get torn apart and traditions get buried, and I know some folks think that's progress." Elena stared at him in amazement. This white rancher understood what most of his own people refused to see, that the schools weren't about education, they were about erasure. "Why?" she asked. "Why help us when you knew?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. 3 years ago, my wife and son died of cholera. For months after, I was angry at God, angry at the world, angry at everything. Then one day I realized I could spend the rest of my life being bitter about what I'd lost, or I could honor their memory by helping others live. He looked directly at Elena, and she saw a depth of pain in his eyes that matched her own. "Every jug of water I leave, every bit of food, it's not charity, it's remembrance. It's keeping their kindness alive in a world that seems to have less of it every day." Elena felt tears threaten for the first time in months. She'd spent so long being strong, being the protector, being the one who made impossible decisions and lived with the consequences. To hear this stranger speak of loss and healing, to see his quiet strength, it awakened parts of her heart she'd thought were dead. "The children," she said, "they're not mine by blood, but they're yours by choice." "I understand." Before Elena could respond, a small voice called out from the cluster of rocks behind the well. "Elena, is it safe?" Jake saw Elena's entire body tense, her hand moving again to her knife. The trust they'd been building hung by a thread, and one wrong word could shatter it forever. "You can tell them it's safe," Jake said quietly. "I'm not here to hurt anyone." Elena studied his face for another long moment, then made a decision that went against every survival instinct she'd developed. "Come out, little ones," but slowly. 4 children emerged from their hiding place like desert spirits materializing from the rocks. Jake's breath caught as he saw them, so young, so thin, so clearly marked by hardship, but still carrying themselves with dignity. Mary Littlefeather came first, her 14-year-old frame straight and proud despite everything she'd endured. Behind her came Tommy, only 8, but with eyes that had seen too much. Miguel Santos bounced on his toes with nervous energy, while little Lucy clung to Mary's skirt and peeked out with huge, solemn eyes. "Children," Elena said in careful English, "this is the man who's been leaving water for us." Tommy stepped forward with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "Are you really a cowboy?" Jake smiled. the first genuine smile Elena had seen from him. "I suppose I am. And you're really an Apache brave, aren't you?" Tommy beamed and nodded vigorously. Miguel couldn't contain himself any longer. "Senor, your water saved us when Lucy was sick with fever. Elena made medicine from desert plants, but without water." He shrugged eloquently. Jake felt something twist in his chest. These children had been sick, desperate, and his simple offerings had made the difference between life and death. But even as the moment of connection warmed his heart, Jake noticed how Eleanor remained alert, scanning the horizons. She was a woman who'd learned that safety was always temporary. "Ma'am," Jake said carefully, "I noticed fresh horse tracks about a mile back. Military from the look of them." Elena's face went pale. "How many?" "Dozen, maybe more. Heading this way, but moving slow. Storm probably scattered them last night." The children instinctively moved closer to Eleanor, their brief moment of childhood wonder replaced by familiar fear. Jake saw how they looked to her for protection, how completely they trusted her to keep them safe. "We need to go," Elena said, but Jake could hear the exhaustion in her voice. "Where?" Jake asked. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but you look like you haven't had a real rest in months. The children too." Elena's laugh was bitter. "Rest is a luxury we can't afford. They're hunting us, every day, every mile, and if they catch us—" She didn't finish, but Jake could imagine. Returned students face severe punishment, and their kidnapper would face much worse. "I have a ranch," Jake said quietly. "Good water, plenty of food, hidden valley where no one goes but me." Eleanor stared at him. "You're offering us shelter." "I'm offering you a chance to rest before you decide what comes next. You could be hanged for helping us. I could, but I won't be able to live with myself if I don't." The offer hung in the air between them. Elena felt the terrible temptation of safety, of not having to make life or death decisions for one day, one night. But accepting would put this kind stranger at terrible risk. "Elena," Mary said softly, speaking Apache, "the little ones are tired. Lucy can barely walk and Tommy tries to hide it, but his feet are bleeding again." Eleanor looked at the children she'd sworn to protect. Lucy was indeed swaying with exhaustion, her small face pinched with hunger despite Jake's daily offerings. Tommy's proud smile couldn't hide the pain in his eyes. Even Miguel's irrepressible spirit seemed dimmed. "If we come," Elena said slowly, "and soldiers follow, then we'll deal with that when it happens," Jake replied. "But right now, you need help, and I'm offering it." Elena closed her eyes and made a decision that could save them all, or doom them all. "All right, but just for one night." Jake nodded, understanding the tremendous trust she was placing in him. "One night. And then whatever you decide." But as they hurried toward Jake's hidden canyon, the sound of distant hoofbeats echoed across the desert. The military patrol was closer than any of them had thought. The hidden canyon that sheltered Jake's ranch was a miracle of desert geography, a deep cleft in the red rocks that opened into a verdant valley fed by an underground spring. Ancient cottonwoods provided blessed shade, and the sound of running water seemed impossible in this land of drought and desperation. Elena stood at the canyon entrance, hardly believing what she saw. After months of bare survival in the open desert, this place looked like paradise. Jake's ranch house was modest but well built, adobe walls thick enough to stay cool in summer heat, with a wide porch that caught every breath of breeze. A vegetable garden flourished near the spring, and a small corral held 3 horses that nickered softly at their approach. The children needed no encouragement. Lucy broke away from Mary's protective grip and ran toward the spring, falling to her knees to splash the clear water on her face. Tommy and Miguel weren't far behind, laughing with pure joy at the abundance after months of careful rationing. Inside the house, Jake showed them to a spare room with 2 real beds. Elena felt tears threaten again at the simple luxury of it all. Clean rooms with real mattresses, a kitchen with shelves of preserved food, windows with glass that kept out dust and wind while letting in light. As the exhausted children finally allowed themselves to truly rest, Elena and Jake sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the canyon walls. The moment felt surreal after months of constant danger and movement. "Tell me about the school," Jake said gently. Elena was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. "The Carlisle Industrial School claims to kill the Indian to save the man. Children arrive speaking their native languages, practicing their traditions, connected to their families. They leave different." She described the systematic destruction of identity, haircut, languages forbidden, traditions labeled as shameful. She told him about Mary and Tommy, Apache siblings whose parents died in the reservation wars. About Miguel, a Mexican boy swept up in the system after his family was killed. About little Lucy, taken from her Navajo family at age 6 and beaten for singing her grandmother's lullaby. "I was a teacher there," Elena admitted, shame coloring her voice. "Half Apache, half Mexican, educated in mission schools. They thought I was civilized enough to help with their work." Jake listened without judgment as she described 6 months of watching children's spirits break, of trying to work within a system designed for cultural destruction, of finally reaching the breaking point when Lucy was whipped for remembering her grandmother's love. "The night I took them," Elena said, "I knew we'd probably die in the desert, but I also knew that what was happening to them was worse than death." "How long have you been running?" 6 months. They put bounties on our heads immediately, $50 per child, $500 for me, dead or alive." Jake absorbed this information silently. $500 was more money than most men saw in 2 years. "You could have turned us in at any time," Elena said. "Why didn't you?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the children sleeping peacefully for the first time in months. "My wife Martha was a teacher before we married," he said finally. "She used to say that education should open minds, not close them, that learning should help children become the best version of themselves, not a copy of someone else." He turned to Eleanor. "What they're doing at that school isn't education. It's destruction, and I won't be part of destroying children." Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest. A wall she'd built around her heart to survive months of constant danger and impossible responsibility. But their moment of peace was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats echoing from the canyon entrance. Both froze, listening to the approaching riders. "How many?" Elena asked, her hand moving instinctively to her knife. Jake listened carefully. 8, maybe 10, moving fast. The sound of a military bugle cut through the air, answering any remaining questions. Elena was already moving toward the children's room when Jake caught her arm. "Wait," he said. "There's another way." He led her quickly to what looked like a solid wall near the fireplace, but when Jake pressed a hidden lever, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow passage. "Apache Tunnel," he explained. "The guides who showed my father this place built it decades ago. Leads to a cave system that opens 3 miles north." Elena stared at the hidden passage, then at Jake. "Come with us." "I can't. If they find the ranch empty, they'll know something's wrong. But if I'm here acting normal, they'll arrest you the moment they find evidence we were here. Maybe, but if I'm not here, they'll hunt you with everything they have." The sound of horses grew closer. Elena woke the children quickly, and they gathered at the tunnel entrance with the practiced efficiency of people who'd learned to run at a moment's notice. "Jake," Elena said desperately, "they'll kill you." "They might, but if I don't try to buy you time, they'll definitely kill you and the children." Elena looked into his eyes and saw the same fierce protectiveness she felt for the children. This man, this stranger who'd been saving their lives for months, was willing to die to give them a chance at freedom. "If you survive this," she said, stepping close to him, "find us, the Gila River settlements, ask for Elena Vasquez. And if I don't survive..." Elena placed her hand briefly on his chest, feeling his heart beat strong and steady beneath her palm. Then know that your kindness saved 4 innocent lives, and that somewhere in this desert a woman will remember forever the man who chose mercy over safety. Before Jake could respond, Eleanor and the children disappeared into the passage. Jake closed the hidden door just as Colonel Marcus Wellington and his soldiers rode into the yard. "Mr. Thompson," Wellington called, dismounting with military precision. "By order of the territorial government, we're searching for escaped criminals." Jake stepped onto his porch, outwardly calm despite his racing heart. "Colonel, can't say I've seen anyone matching that description." Wellington's cold blue eyes studied Jake's face. "Is that so? Because we have reports of someone leaving supplies for fugitives, someone matching your description. I sometimes leave water for travelers," Jake said truthfully. "Desert's a hard place. Christian duty to help those in need." Wellington gestured to his men to search the house. They would find signs, recently used beds, extra plates, children's footprints in the garden. Sure enough, Sergeant Morrison emerged holding a small corn-husk doll that Lucy had dropped. "Colonel," Morrison called, "found this in the spare room. Indian-made." Wellington examined the doll with satisfaction. "Well, Mr. Thompson, still claiming you haven't seen our fugitives?" Jake met the Colonel's stare steadily. "I've seen lots of things in my life, Colonel. Most of them are none of your business." Wellington's face flushed red. "You're harboring criminals, Thompson. That's a hanging offense." "Maybe, but terrorizing children is worse than criminal. It's evil." The words hung in the air between them. Wellington's hand moved to his sidearm, but before he could draw, one of his scouts came riding hard into the yard. "Colonel," the scout called, "found tracks leading out of the canyon. Fresh ones. They're heading north toward the Gila." Wellington holstered his weapon with visible reluctance. "We'll continue this conversation later, Thompson, and next time we'll have evidence you can't deny." As the soldiers mounted up and rode north in pursuit of tracks that would lead them in circles for days, Jake allowed himself a small smile. Elena had mentioned Gila River settlements, but the tunnel actually led east toward Apache territory where she'd find real sanctuary. Whatever happened to him, they would live. And sometimes that was enough. 3 months later, Jake stood at the same abandoned well where his journey had begun. But now he wasn't alone. Eleanor knelt beside him, carefully tending the small garden they'd planted around the stone structure. What had once been a place of secret charity had become a symbol of hope. The children played nearby, healthy and strong and free. Mary had grown into a beautiful young woman who served as translator for other refugee families. Tommy's laughter rang across the desert as he raced Miguel through the scrub brush, and Lucy, sweet little Lucy, sang Navajo lullabies her grandmother had taught her, the songs no longer forbidden. Jake's trial had become a turning point. When Elena emerged from hiding to testify about the horrors at the Carlisle school, public sentiment began to shift. Her quiet dignity and perfect English forced people to confront their assumptions about civilization and education. The school was closed 6 months later. Colonel Wellington was quietly reassigned. Dr. Whitman, the brutal director, faced federal charges. And the network of underground safe houses that had started with Jake's simple offerings grew into something that touched lives across the territory. Elena straightened from her gardening, wiping soil from her hands. She wore a simple blue dress now, her hair braided with ribbons Lucy had woven. She looked like any rancher's wife, but Jake knew the fierce spirit that still burned beneath the domestic exterior. "The Henderson family will be here tonight," Elena said, referring to refugees fleeing violence in East Texas. "And Father Miguel sent word that 3 Apache families need passage north." Jake nodded, already calculating supplies and safe routes. They'd found their rhythm, his practical knowledge combined with her understanding of how hunted people survived. Elena, Jake said softly, and something in his tone made her look up. She stood silhouetted against the setting sun, her face soft with love and gratitude, and something deeper, the knowledge that they'd found each other against impossible odds. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For seeing us as human beings when the world said we were criminals. For choosing mercy when justice would have been easier. For showing me that kindness isn't weakness. It's the strongest force in the world." Jake moved to her side, taking her work-roughened hands in his. "Marry me," he said simply. "Not because you need protection or I need help. Marry me because somehow, in this broken world, we've found something worth building together." Elena studied his honest eyes, his gentle smile, the hands that had never been raised in anger, despite all he'd endured. "Yes," she said, and watched joy transform his features. They kissed as the desert sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, two survivors who'd found more than safety in each other's arms. They'd found home. Behind them, the sound of children's laughter echoed across the desert as Mary taught the others traditional dances while Lucy sang ancient songs in her grandmother's language. The songs were no longer whispered in shame, but declared proudly, carrying across the evening air like prayers of gratitude. Later that night, as they prepared for the arrival of more refugees, Elena reflected on how far they'd come. 6 months ago, she'd been a desperate woman, leading 4 traumatized children across a merciless desert, surviving on strangers' charity and determination. Now she was part of something larger, a network of good people who decided that right and wrong mattered more than law and order. Jake's simple act of leaving water for unknown travelers had grown into a movement that touched lives across the territory. "You know what I've learned?" Elena said as they walked the perimeter of their property, checking for signs of trouble as they did every night. "What's that?" "Kindness is contagious. One person's compassion creates more compassion. Your water and food didn't just keep us alive, it showed us that goodness still existed in the world." Jake smiled, thinking of the network they'd built, former slaves helping Native Americans, Mexican families sheltering Chinese immigrants, white ranchers like himself who'd chosen conscience over conformity. "My father used to say that civilization isn't about the buildings we construct or the laws we write," Jake said. "It's about how we treat the most vulnerable among us." They walked in comfortable silence, two people who'd learned that sometimes the greatest love stories began with the smallest acts of mercy. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. More refugees to help, more risks to navigate, more chances to choose between safety and righteousness. But tonight, under the vast Arizona sky, they had each other. They had 4 children who were learning to trust again. They had a home that stood as proof that different cultures could blend into something beautiful. And they had the knowledge that somewhere in the desert, other desperate people would find water and food left by kind strangers, carrying on a tradition of compassion that had started with one lonely rancher's desire to honor his family's memory. As they prepared for bed, Elena paused at the window that looked out toward the abandoned well. In the moonlight, she could see the small garden they'd planted there, flowers and vegetables that thrived in the harsh desert, drawing sustenance from the spring Jake's father had discovered decades ago. Like love, she thought, like healing, like hope itself. Sometimes the most beautiful things grew in the most unlikely places, nurtured by the simple human decision to be kind when kindness wasn't required, to be brave when bravery wasn't rewarded, to be good when goodness wasn't appreciated. Jake Thompson had left water for a stranger in the heat, never knowing who would drink it. What he'd discovered was that kindness, like water in the desert, was never truly lost. It flowed underground, unseen but vital, until it surfaced again in unexpected places, bringing life to everything it touched. And in the end, that was miracle enough.